Well, first let me just say I'm very excited. This is actually my first Quakecon, and and as much as John was very kind to mention how, at the very least, maybe I'm a little bit older than he is, maybe by a couple of years, who have gotten started a couple of years before. But I'm sure you guys would understand why I would think this is kind of the Mutual Admiration Society in the sense of the stuff that Id, through John's work and the rest of his teams, has accomplished down through the years is phenomenal, clearly second to none. And the fact that you are all here at a Quakecon, which there's never been an UltimaCon, sadly, but it's really testimony to the impact they've had. And I actually think it's interesting that not only have we kind of run these parallel tracks in games, but the fact that we're running a parallel track in space, I think, is not just an accident of two people that have to be interested in space. I actually think there's something about the community of gamers and developers who are into exploration, into technology, that space is a real natural outgrowth for, and it's not just me and John who are doing this. There's lots of other people that I'll talk about periodically that are kindred spirits to all of us that are also on this strangely parallel journey of gaming in space. And so I'm really going to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk about, one, my own flight to space and how I pulled that off. I also want to talk a little bit about why I think space travel is really important, some of my takeaways from my own journey. And then I'm going to, as a segue to pass back to John, I'm going to talk a little bit about my interpretation of the future of space travel that is now coming, and how and why I think all of us will get a chance to go back to space here in the not distant future really at all. So when I flew a year and a half ago, my actual mission was called Visiting Crew 15. I was the 15th short duration expedition to the International Space Station. I had a crew of 1. I was the only person on that particular mission. But as I think about kind of the thread for me that ties this all together, it's because the way I approach game development is really as a storyteller. I mean, John approaches both rocketry and his game development from what I'll call a much closer tie to the technology than I've ever done. But my thread, at least, is really more as a storyteller. And I get this from this interesting combination of my parents. My dad was a NASA astronaut. He flew twice in space, once aboard the Skylab, and then his second flight was on the space shuttle, the 9th launch of the space shuttle. My mother, on the other hand, is a professional artist. She's done, she does everything from pottery to painting to silversmithing and all kinds of things. So my summer activities was always learning whatever art she was into that summer. And that combination of high tech and art is really what led me into games, because I think games are really the quintessential high tech art. And I actually go back to even before the Apple II. I was working, my first computer back in 1974 was a teletype connected with an acoustic modem to an off-site PDP-11 at the high school I went to. And the high school had this terminal, but had no classes that taught it, no teacher that knew anything about it. But the faculty knew that I was a good self-starter, we'll call it. I was really into competing in things like science fairs. They let me have my own class where I taught myself how to program as my class. And they just said, "What are you going to do this year, Richard?" And my answer was always, "Make some games." And they were like, "Okay, go ahead." And at the end of this semester, I'd hand in my few games that I'd made. So I made this series of games called D&D 1, as in Dungeons and Dragons 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and finally up to 28. So by the time I graduated from high school, I'd written 28 little D&D games. In fact, all right, those paper tape spools were the thing. Yeah, those are the little. In fact, if you look up in the upper right-hand corner there, you can see the paper tape punches. There's 8 holes in a row, 8 large holes, and that's the 8 bits for the ASCII characters. But in my classes in English, what I began to write, the history of Ultima, is actually written. I use that as my English papers. So the story of Mondane the Wizard. This is one of the rare times I got an A in English, because I was usually a pretty C student, especially in English. But that's actually the history of Mondane the Wizard before Ultima began. During high school, became kind of my class papers. And my mother, you can see there on the upper right, kind of taught me how to draw in perspective, which is eventually how D&D 28B became a Calibeth, my first published product. And then after publishing a couple Ultimas, I started Origin with my brother. We started literally, classically in my parents' garage. And in my mind, the key to the success of the Ultima series was this kind of devotion to innovation, kind of starting over and over again. And I think that's something you'll see in not only my companies, but John's and all the truly successful people over the history of this industry, I think have been strongly devoted to this technological innovation coupled with whatever creative capability they put behind it. And I also had the good fortune, not only was I lucky to be at the right age at the right time for the start of computer games at all, but I also had the good fortune to work with the team, the Ultima Online team, which was really the first big successful massively multiplayer game. So I really got to have two kind of key starts, key moments in the computer industry I had a chance to really participate in and be a key participant in. But I'll get back to space here in a second by transitioning even through other parts of my life. This is my home in Austin, Texas, where, again, going back to this, I'm a collector and teller of stories. My house has secret passageways and a dungeon and indoor waterfalls and observatory and all kinds of wacky stuff. And I collect more wacky stuff, skeletons and space memorabilia. I have these things called automata, which are kind of mechanical analogs to computer games in my mind. They're little mechanical toys that you turn the cranks and they perform performances. So it's like animation, but mechanical. I do these big haunted houses that some of you may have heard of, or maybe some of you even been to. In my mind, this is like live performance for the game industry, because we do, unlike a musician who gets up on stage to sing a tune, in our industry, there's other than like Quakecon maybe, for most of us anyway, we've never really had an opportunity for live performance, and so haunted houses represent that to me. And when we talk about creating these virtual worlds to go explore, that drive for exploration that we all get out of creating and playing virtual world games, for me at least, is also true about exploring. I get the same joy out of exploring the reality in which we live. And that exploration can mean the automatons, it can mean study of history, it can mean camping trips or exploring as far out into the rest of the world as you can. And so for me, I've used the money I've generated in the games industry to get a chance to go explore the world, which finally leads us now to space. And I grew up in an astronaut community, you might say. Not only was my dad an astronaut, but literally my right and left-hand neighbors were astronauts. I grew up believing basically that everybody was going to go to space because everybody I knew did go to space. But it was really shocking though for me when I was finally told at about the age of 13 by a NASA doctor that I was not going to be allowed to go to space. He said, Richard, you've got bad eyesight, you're going to need glasses, and by the way, that means you're no longer eligible to be a NASA astronaut. And that was actually quite crushing because that was like being told you are no longer eligible to be a member of the club that your father and all your neighbors are members of. And so after a brief depression, having been told that, I said, well, wait a minute, who are you, doctor at NASA, to be the gatekeeper for who gets to go to space? And I said, if I can't go with your club, I'm gonna have to make my own club. And so, starting as a teenager, even before I was making games, I said, look, I'm gonna figure out a way to develop a civilian space agency. And of course, at the age of 13, you have no idea how incredibly difficult that is going to prove to be. And I won't bother going with the story of all the failed attempts at bringing into existence civilian space travel, but there were many. And for about a decade, all of the investing I did with the money I'd earned out of the Ultima series went into the privatization of space, 99% of which did not work. However, then I got together with the group that started the X Prize. We put together this $10 million prize for the first private vehicle to fly twice into space. We started a company called Zero G Corp, which flies parabolic flights that anybody can take. And by the way, I highly recommend it. That's a lot of fun. And we started a company called Space Adventures, which at the time was going to sell suborbital flights that were going to be generated by the X Prize. However, we couldn't even raise the $10 million for the X Prize for the first 5 years, and so we got tired of waiting, and so then we said, well, let's go on to orbit. And so we contacted the Russians, and we negotiated a price to be able to take people to the International Space Station on the Russian Soyuz rocket. And actually, I was scheduled to be the first private citizen to fly into space, but this was in the year 2000, which is when the internet stock market crashed, and thus went my wealth that all came from the internet. And so I actually lost my first chance to go and had to sell that seat to a guy named Dennis Tito, who became the first civilian in space. But fortunately, I circled back, waited for the recovery, and then finally became the sixth private citizen to fly in space. And as John actually mentioned, there have been just about 500 people now who have gone. I was actually of course, if you're one of those 500, you keep count. I'm the 483rd person who has orbited the Earth. And I'm also the first father-son combination from the American side, and I flew with the first Russian father-son pairing too, that we ushered in the first what I'll call the second generation of space. And so in October 2007, that's when early 2007, that's when I committed to the flight. But just because you want to go, just because you've negotiated the ticket, and just because you have the outrageous sum of money that you can pay for it, still doesn't mean they'll let you go. There's one more major hurdle, which is medical qualification. And it turns out, just like they would, for my bad eyesight, they would flush you out of NASA. Space travel is actually very hard on your body, and most people are not medically perfect. And so once you scan yourself to incredible detail, which they do before you take a space flight, you're going to be pretty far away from any doctor and hospital, there's reasonable odds they're going to find something. And in my case, what they found was something called a hemangioma. I'd actually had 6 arteries feeding my liver, but only 5 veins draining it. So there's one lobe of my liver that's overpressured, which could represent an increased chance of internal bleeding in the unlikely case of rapid depressurization of a spacecraft. And so they actually made me remove it. So I now have that nice 18-inch scar across my belly as another one of my mementos of the price I paid to go to space. Finally then, in January of 2008, I got a chance to start training. Did all kinds of fun things like had my body cast in plaster to make the spacesuit and the seat that would be sitting in for high-G maneuvers. I began the Soyuz training. What's interesting about the training also too is any of you who are into computer games, and especially some of the stuff that John and Id make, if you can handle the computer games that we play, I assure you training for spaceflight will be no trouble. And in fact, you'll really enjoy it, because you go through first, you just learn all the layout of the systems. You learn things like the communication systems. If you've operated any kind of ham radio, for example, this would be no trouble. You go through the life support systems, but if you're a scuba diver, again, it's basically the same kind of stuff, so there's no trouble. You go through all the simulators, which is really, frankly, just good fun. You do have to do it all in Russian, which is a bit of a problem. Once you start training on the ISS, that's at least now bilingual, since everything's both in English and in Russian. But again, it's all fairly logical systems. None of it's what I'll call particularly hard, but there is a lot of material to learn. Because you have to independently be able to operate every system on board the Soyuz and on board the space station. You do some fun things like zero-G training to make sure that you can get in and out of your spacesuit without the help of gravity. One of my least favorite parts about training was the eating meals on a Russian military base. I only began to take pictures of my meals as I realized I was getting served the same meal for breakfast and lunch and dinner every day. In fact, 3 of those happen to be breakfast, and the only reason I know that is because there's hard-boiled eggs sitting next to the plates. But otherwise, you basically get the same thing all the time. And do survival training. The hardest part of the survival training was actually open sea survival, which was actually extremely arduous. I mean, you really come close to the point of passing out because of the difficulty in heat and other things too. That was actually the hardest part of the training. And then finally, you go through final exams, and I have to pass all the same tests as any other astronaut or cosmonaut. And then after that, you begin to inspect and pack. You then go out to the launch site in Baikonur in Kazakhstan. You can see my father there is with me there too. He got to help me through my training. He ran my mission control team while I was in space and was with me when I picked me up in the rockets at the end. Another unfun part of training was the rotating chair that they put you in. It's purposefully trying to make yourself sick. And so, of course, every day you go sit in the rotating chair until you get sick. And so every day you can survive in it a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer, but every day you're basically getting sick. And then you really don't feel good for the rest of the day afterwards. It was like the worst class. Oh, it's time for rotating chair class. Oh, yeah, the rest of the day is wasted. And relevant to the future of rockets that we're going to be talking about too is that we got just before launch, we got our rescue briefings that in case there was an abort during launch, they had literally thousands, and I really think probably past more than 10,000 people spread out downrange of the launch site that they do for every launch, that they had deployed them like a week before launch. And if you think about that many people being deployed for every launch, you think about the costs of rocketry. In addition to this giant rocket that they build once, fly once, and is destroyed, you also have the thousands of people it takes to operate it, and the thousands of people they use, for example, downrange in the case of emergency aborts. And that will remember that data when we circle back. Another thing I found really interesting though was You know, if you're familiar with the way the space shuttle launches, I mean, they launched, or they put the space shuttle out on the pad, you know, a week or two prior to launch. Well, here we are 48 hours before my launch, and my rocket is in pieces. They haven't even finished bolting it together. In fact, the booster is in one building, and the orbital module is literally an entire other building. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, man, I hope they have time not only to put it together, but test it, you know, before we get in this thing and launch it. Finally, the day before, they roll it out to the pad, and then I'm sure you can understand that, you know, finally on October 12th, when you put on your own custom-made spacesuit, you walk out to a fully fueled rocket that is covered with frost because the cryogenic fuel's on board, and while everybody else gets as far away as they can, you know, you and your friends squeeze inside this little, you know, quite claustrophobic, you know, 6-foot space on the top of this gigantic pile of fuel, and then with a surprisingly low-key, relaxed countdown, finally light that sucker up, and you go, in 8.5 minutes, you go from sitting still on the ground to orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour. And that's a pretty phenomenal day, the launch day. But, of course, being a gamer, even during launch, I have all my checklists that I'm going through, and I knew at one page of the checklist that there would be a camera turned on inside the capsule broadcasting to the ground. So I actually took up a secret message to my tabula rasa players, written in the runic, you know, the symbolic language of the game that I flashed up on the camera screen during launch, which, you know, of course I didn't get permission for that before I did it, but didn't seem to get in too much trouble. And then finally, after that 8.5-minute ride, you know, this is the first time the spacecraft keeled over, and I got my first view of the Earth. Of course, I'm pretty happy at that point. But even though it only takes 8.5 minutes to get to space, you're in that 8.5 minutes, you're now up at basically the same altitude and basically the same speed as the space station. But they don't bring you particularly close to the space station at that moment because they don't want to hit it on accident. And they actually spend 2 days slowly coming together and docking. So for 2 days, you live in this very tiny space on board the Soyuz TMA-13. You know, we had our meals there, slept there, that sort of thing. It was actually surprisingly busy, so the time went pretty quick. One kind of interesting effect that we did notice there was something called sprites, where you're now outside of a lot of the atmosphere that protects you from radiation. So when you sleep, subatomic particles going through your brain and your eyes cause little white flashes that you see while you're trying to go to sleep. So it's yeah, kind of disconcerting when you realize how irradiated you're getting during this journey. Periodically, you'll just see some nice views out the window here in this in my presentation. But 2 days later, here we go on October 14th, as we're beginning to approach to dock with the International Space Station. And once we're on board, the space station itself is actually an amazingly cluttered place. My workstation is that little kind of green area on the left with the book kind of open wide and some mission patches and things in front of it. And that camera with a giant lens is one I'm using, and the window directly below it is kind of the window I'm using to look out of. But just really, again, you know, beautiful views from the inside. It's very comfortable on the inside. But just outside the window, of course, you have not only the hard vacuum of space and the amazing amount of radiation, but if you're in the shade, you'd freeze to death, and if you're in the sunlight, you'd burn up. And so the harshness that exists just outside that window is very striking. Then, you know, another thing that's kind of fun about floating around in space is, of course, attitude. It becomes irrelevant. For example, you know, the galley was built for 3 people, and there's 6 of us on board, so we tended to use both the ceiling and the floor in order to all cram around the galley. Also, you know, sleeping is kind of interesting because there's no real bedrooms. In fact, you know, they give you little sleeping bags so you kind of feel like you have a place to sleep. And I used bungee cords to make mine strapped to a surface so it at least felt like I was lying down. But most people just kind of hang still, and they kind of take the fetal position when they relax and close their eyes. And they use a string or a shoelace or something to tie themselves to the floor somewhere. Because if you don't, the air conditioning will carry you through, and you'll wake up in the morning on the intake vent. Which is also where you tend to find everything that you lose, because you can tell the beginners from the experienced people, because everything's held to the wall with just a little piece of Velcro. But as you're learning how to fly around in zero G, you tend to bump into things, and so when you go through a hallway, you'll turn around and you'll see all the debris that you've brought with you by bumping into it. And you know, if there was one thing I would redesign on the space station, it's the toilet. because gravity is really helpful in taking things from that you get pushed out of your body into a receptacle to get rid of them. And without gravity, this is a much more difficult problem. And it's a story I love to tell in graphic detail, so ask me later, and I'm happy to share that story in detail. And even though a lot of people try to call myself and others like me a space tourist, I hate that word. And because I don't think what I did is tourism at all. I mean, I spent 30 years investing in the privatization of space, and with my flight, even though I was going for my own personal joy, I did also tons of research to offset the cost of that expensive flight and hopefully pay for my future flights. And so I was really looking at this as a business, not as a joyride, although it was a pretty joyful ride. And so, for example, this is just a list of some of the experiments I did, and I'll just rattle some of these off. If you have interest in any of these afterwards, I'm happy to get in to talk about them. I did some biological research called protein crystal growth, which I actually think is the thing that will fund my future flights. I did a bunch of Earth observations as a follow-on to my father's work, because 35 years ago on Skylab, they had the first time that people spent orbiting the Earth, looking back at the Earth, taking a photographic survey of the surface of the Earth. So I thought 35 years later, if I go do the same thing, I can show how the Earth has changed in one generation of spaceflight. We've developed some special software for targeting that didn't exist before, and it turns out NASA liked it and the other astronauts liked it so much they began to take it over. So you can see a laptop just to the right of the rightmost person's head there that's running my software, that after they realized how it worked, they would kick me out and say, look, we're the professionals, we take priority, and left me to just take pictures of them using my tools to take their Earth observations photography. And I caught some shots, like for example, here's a good example of my dad's photographs of Miami and my photographs of Miami, and how much the urban sprawl has grown, as well as how the wetlands have decreased. Another thing I did is ham radio work. My dad took the first amateur radio to space to talk to people around the Earth. I did the same thing, but I also took a slow scan television camera and would broadcast things like pirate flags that said Richard Garriot's mutiny on the ISS, and raised a few eyebrows at NASA, as you might imagine. I did commercial work for a variety of companies. I did educational work. I did medical research for NASA and the Russian Space Agency. In homage to my mother, I did art shows. I'm into magic, so I did some magic. One of the astronauts I went up with is also into magic and juggling, so we did the only juggling I think that's been done in space, especially of various types. We had some intrigue on my flight where there was an explosive bolt that they removed. They did a spacewalk to remove an explosive bolt out of my spacecraft because it was believed to be the cause of what's called a ballistic reentry, a dangerous reentry of the flight just before mine. And so here I am modeling the explosive bolts and hoping that we survive reentry. There were malfunctions on every flight, like in this case, the water processor that we all use to get fresh water out of tends to get wet because you're using it to dispense water, and so it electrically shorted out, it spewed steam and melted plastic all through the space station. So there we are, kind of removing it and replacing it. And then after 12 days, sadly, it was time to go. And so we undocked with the space station. We go into free flight again, and if you look at this picture of the Soyuz orbital module, we're in the middle section, the middle third of it. The top sphere, the ball at one end, is the habitation module that we've lived in for the 2 days before docking. That's going to be ejected. The part with the solar panels on it, called the service module, is also going to be ejected. The little green periscope is going to be ejected, and just the descent module, that middle third, is what's going to come to the Earth. And when you finally do re-enter, when you come back in and hit the Earth's atmosphere, you're still going 17,000 miles an hour. That is really fast. That is so fast that the friction of hitting the Earth's atmosphere creates heat that is hotter than the surface of the sun. And so here I'm in the right, if I was in the center seat, I could touch both outer windows. So, but I'm touching, my shoulder is touching the window, and about 3 inches of glass later is a plasma that is hotter than the surface of the sun. And not only that, but those little sparks that you see going by there are actually the heat shield melting away. So you can not only see the general glow of the plasma, but the vehicle is literally melting around you as you're coming in. And by the way, I've videotaped the entire reentry, so if we have time later this evening, if you see me at the bar or wherever we're hanging out this evening, I'm happy to show you the 5-minute video of the reentry process all the way to the ground. It's the only video of reentry of a spacecraft that exists, by the way. We also had malfunctions during our reentry. I had a During the parachute opening, I had a bottle of this big metal container dislodge and get jammed between my shoulder and the window and cause all kinds of crazy problems. We had smoke come pour into the capsule. Right about the time the heat shield drops away, there's a valve that opens to equalize pressure from outside to inside, and smoke that's, we believe it was something from the outside of the vehicle came in through that valve to the inside that caused us to have a little concern during this phase of operations. But then finally you come down and you hit the ground. And unlike the shuttle which lands on the runway, unlike Apollo which landed in the water, the Russians land under a parachute, but ka-wham on the ground at 30 or 40 miles an hour, just ka-wham. That is, and if you watch the video that I have later, it is a bone-jarring impact, but safe enough. I mean, you're in a padded seat and it's got a shock absorber on it, so the violence around you is incredible, but you actually feel quite comfortable during the process. But it looks good on video. Then you get the recovery. My father was there, as I mentioned. Again, this was a cool thing for the two of us to really bond in a way we've never had previously. Pardon me. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about seeing the Earth from space, and why, for me, it was really a profoundly life-changing event, and why I think that it would be for anybody who did this. And so it's hard to relate in just a few slides why I think this is so compelling. But again, why the work that John's doing in opening up the space frontier for everyone is really so important. Of course, it's beautiful. The view from space is beautiful. But there's a series of what I'll call epiphanies that you go through as you look out the window and see space. And I'll try to take you on this journey with a few pictures. The first thing I noticed after the beauty was just how finite, not only the scale of the Earth was, because like when you see, in my case, Houston, Austin, Dallas, things we know the distance of from driving around pretty well, but also the entire planet, you go, I now know the true scale of the Earth by direct observation, which is actually a pretty meaningful moment. Then you notice how thin the atmosphere is, especially at sunrise and sunset, like on this picture. You can see that only 10 to 20 times higher than the clouds, and the atmosphere is so thin it no longer refracts light, which means it's basically non-existent. And as you look down at the Earth, you add that up, because you know now the scale of the Earth, you know how thin that is, you're going like, wow, there's just not much. And especially when you see things like a forest fire and see how that covers entire states with soot, you go like, wow, it's actually pretty reasonable that the stuff that comes out of our tailpipes and factory stacks would completely permeate the small amount of air we have. But when you look straight down at the Earth, you actually still feel quite intimate. Like, that doesn't look that dissimilar to looking out the window of an airplane, if you know what I mean. You still see the clouds and the contrails, all these familiar things. You're further away, but not so much further away you feel removed. You actually still feel quite intimately close. But you're traveling along at 17,000 miles an hour, so you go across the entire United States in like 5 minutes. So it's booking. But you still are intimately close. For example, when you look out the window at San Francisco, you'll notice you can see here, there's the Golden Gate Bridge, here's the Oakland Bay Bridge, here's Alcatraz, and if you look over here at the ship that's coming in, you can see the ship's wakes out behind it. I mean, it's really stunningly intimate view of the Earth, in spite of the fact that you're in space. But when you look not straight down, when you look out horizontally, you then feel how high you are, so to speak. You feel, you see what I'll call the large-scale systems of the Earth. And for example, if you look out over the Pacific, which is one giant, the largest ocean we have, it's all fairly what I'll call homogeneous. There's not mountains, there's not things to change the temperature underneath it. So the weather that forms over it forms these giant laminar fronts and things that you only see out of over the Pacific. On the other hand, over the Atlantic, where there's lots of shallower water that's warmer and lots of land masses to kind of build what I call a more chaotic environment, that's where we always saw these more interesting weather formations like this hurricane. Deserts were the first place you generally saw a lot of the Earth, the ground, because a lot of the fertile parts are covered with clouds a lot of the time. And when you look down at deserts, you see a lot of what I'll call the tectonic results of the formation of the Earth. So you can see how plates have moved and ground into each other and built mountains. You see the results of eons of water erosion. Same thing with wind erosion. Of course, I had to go find my house when I flew past it, here in Austin. But one of the things I noticed while looking for my house that only really comes to you after 2 or 3 days or more like a couple weeks of being in space is you realize that every fertile part of the Earth you can see from space is fully occupied by people. There was no green part of the Earth that was not either a farm or a city. I saw no part of the earth that I would call truly vast, untouched wilderness. Even the places that are hard to build, like you go look at these alpine regions, you can still see roads and dams and things inside of them. Same thing in the deserts, not only terraforming the size of the earth, but all the deserts are crisscrossed with roads, and all the ancient riverbeds have water being pumped to the surface to grow crops on them all over the world. And so there truly was no part of the world I ever saw from space that did not look under what I'll call maximum human utilization that it could be based upon the resources that were there. And when I was young, my dad used to tell me tales of his flight, where he would notice every time he went over the Amazon how the fires were burning and the entire country was covered with smoke. And that's still true to this day. And the same thing's true for the central part of Africa, is also always covered with smoke. And those epiphanies that I had while traveling in space about the scale of the Earth and the impact of humanity on the Earth inspired me to come back and go, well, that's your subjective impression from looking. What does the objective satellite data say? Because for about the same period of time, we've had very, very sensitive instruments taking much more accurate measurements. And you're probably not too surprised to find out that, in fact, satellites tell you basically the same thing, that the human consumption of the natural productivity of the surface of the Earth is pretty close to 1-to-1 we're consuming basically what it naturally produces, which doesn't mean we can't produce more. It just means the cost of fresh water, the cost of food, the cost of clean air is going to continue to rise and rise. And so even though I would have described myself as an environmentalist before I went, I've much more redoubled my efforts since I've been back. And so, for example, in my home in Austin, I've re-insulated the place, changed out lots of doors and windows, changed all my lighting to LEDs. I've added tons of photovoltaic arrays, and I'm trying to get down to 1-to-1 energy utilization, and doing all kinds of other things, like I got rid of all my fancy sports cars, and instead I'm building electric cars. Okay, so now I'm in the final phase here. It's sort of a John introduction in a way. Let me talk a little bit about this new space race that I think we're in, and why I think this is so exciting for all of us. And so I've made my one big expensive opportunity to go into space. I spent most of my net worth pulling off the flight on the Soyuz, so I'm not going back that way, I don't think. For me to go again, and for everybody generally to be able to go, we've got to find a way to open access to space in a much more practical way, and that's what John is really leading the charge to do. For example, if you look at space travel today, it is both really expensive and really dangerous. And the combination of expense and danger means that it is extremely uncommon, which is not too surprising. But what's interesting, if you look at the history of the development of this technology, we started the space race 50 years ago. And in the first 10 years of that 50 years, there was an incredible revolution. We went from having nothing in space to landing people on the moon, almost all of that within 10, 12 years or so. And even though most of that, what I'll call heavy lifting, was done mostly 50 years ago, we've still only put 500 people to space in the history of humanity. And what's interesting about the early space race and the era that I know I grew up in, and I think John would say this too, we haven't ever talked about this directly, but there is a documentary out called Orphans of Apollo. And it describes people of my generation, and probably most of you, who were inspired by the vision of the future that was represented by 2001: A Space Odyssey, and maybe continued by Star Wars and a few of those things, where a lot of us grew up believing that by now we'd all be living in these donut-shaped space stations with artificial gravity and traveling back and forth to the moon. But then it never happened. But it was so inspirational, that early Apollo stuff was so inspirational, it inspired an entire generation of us to get interested in science, technology, engineering, math, and exploration, and this wonderment of possibility that can exist. But the space program never fulfilled that expectation. And so a bunch of us went off to go build high-tech companies, whether it's computer game companies or other high-tech companies that I'll mention here in just a minute. But as we've seen success, and as we've kind of gotten our anchors there and had that foundation, many of us have circled back. What this documentary calls the orphans of Apollo, people who are abandoned by that vision of Apollo, have circled back now to the space program. And first and foremost among those is John and his Armadillo Aerospace team, many of whom are sitting over here too. These guys, have just done a phenomenal job of winning a bunch of these X Prize challenges, NASA challenges, getting NASA contracts, and now building, suborbital vehicles that you'll hear more about. But he's not the only one. I mean, you guys are probably aware that Elon Musk, the founder of PayPal, who also does Tesla motor cars, has a company called SpaceX. They're not going to be taking cargo and hopefully eventually crew to the International Space Station. You've got Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon.com, who's got his company Blue Origin. They're a little bit secretive. I don't really know exactly what the status is, but I don't think we've still heard any launch. They haven't applied for any launch licenses, so they're still in the dark somewhere. Who knows? A guy named Bob Bigelow, Robert Bigelow, he's a hotel mogul out of Las Vegas that already has 2 inflatable modules in space and will soon, hopefully, with his plans, be building space hotels or private space stations for scientific research. You've got Branson, who has been buying Spaceship 2. Spaceship 1 is the vehicle that did win the $10 million X Prize that we eventually raised the money for and paid out. And Burt Rutanowski Composites is clearly a brilliant aerospace engineer. But I'll tell you in a minute why I think that John's answer is superior in cost and safety and frequency to even this answer, which is also brilliant. There's another one. I think John and I are both small investors in this company, Xcore Aerospace, which is a single stage to orbit space plane they're working on. I would count myself in amongst these as to people who have been investing towards opening the door for this future. And interestingly, even what I'll call the old guard are kind of catching on. The people who built the shuttle or the Atlas rocket or the Delta rocket, they're seeing this new competition coming on board, and they're going like, well, I guess we can't rest on our laurels of the easy government money we used to have. We're going to have to figure out a way to be more entrepreneurial and refit these rockets to be human rated, etc. And so they're turning, and they're also, I think, going to be significant competitors. But you're seeing people come from all extremes to meet in this highly competitive new arena of space. And the main reason I think this can be done is because, again, if you go back to the early NASA days, fundamental issues like what metal to use to hold a cryogenic fuel had to be invented. Pumps to pump cryogenic fuels had to be invented. All these things had to be invented. But now, all those same parts that NASA invented in decades past are available in your air conditioning unit in the back of your house. And what that means, and this is when I was hopefully I'm going to represent these guys correctly. I warned them in advance that since I hadn't shown these guys this particular slide, so I'm hoping they'll either correct me here in a minute or hopefully I'm relating this properly. But one of the things that I found most amazing when I first started going out to Cato Mills and seeing the rockets they were building and their brilliant plan for rapid prototyping and iteration was that they focused their invention on a couple of key pieces that hence previously had never existed. For example, they've created a rocket nozzle that can be fired over and over and over again, since most rockets are used once and then you throw them away. And that's in my mind, a particular piece of brilliance that only this team has ever solved. And will be very important to the future of rocketry across the board. Another really clever thing that again this team is their navigation and control system. It's really just running on a software running on a computer, but I don't know if there's any team that knows software better than John and John's team. I mean, these guys are again brilliant at that. And they had to. There's another special part, which is the fuel tanks. They're made of this, is again a special alloy of aluminum, specially welded. It has to be specially tested because under extreme pressures. But they just buy that from a third party, to my knowledge, or generally speaking, that may not be a misrepresentation. But every other part of that rocket is a part which I've named 3 particularly special parts, but pretty much everything else, you can buy those parts out of catalogs or on the internet, and to my knowledge, that's basically what they do. They go buy all these parts, and they take it to the shop, and they assemble it. And what that implies to me is that once they've developed and invented these other key parts, which they now have, any first robotics team, of which there are thousands of competent high school and college teams around the country that can do these kinds of competitions, they'll be able to follow these guys and build rockets. And so there's now going to be an explosion of people after them who will be able to follow in their footsteps and continue to iterate and continue to, for their high school project, go build a spaceship. And I think it's a very interesting moment in time that we're at. And just in February this year, NASA changed radically their plan for the future. They basically said, look, instead of spending the billions and billions, the tens of billions we are on the plan, that current plan for how to get back to the moon and Mars, that they were going to start investing in the privatization of space, which I think, even though it's highly controversial, I think it's a great idea. instead of doing this whole constellation plan, where if you look at the space station, it took 20 years, $100 billion to build it. It cost $2 billion a year just to not splash into the ocean. And it cost $300 million per astronaut to put anybody up there. Now, if I'm trying to think of a good business to operate in space, and I got to pay for that, I can't think of any business that is worth that amount of money to support it. On the other hand, if you look at every other form of transportation other than space, they all cost about 3 times the energy to operate. So for example, a plane, a boat, a car, a train, if you put $100 of gas in it, you'll have paid another, $200 additional more dollars for insurance and maintenance on your vehicle. And the only difference is space. And the reason why mainly is because remember those thousands of people it took to build it and thousands of people it took to operate it? And the fact that you throw it away every time you use it? Imagine if every time you fill up your car at the gas station, you crushed it and bought another one. Driving would not be very affordable. But if you look at what these guys are doing here, they have created a rocket, which they already, I think, you've flown it like 6 times in a day, if I'm correct, or at least many times in one day. And it's because they've created something that, you drive it out, you put it on a flatbed truck, you drive it out to a launch site, you crane it off, you fill up the fuel and oxidizer tank, you drive away, open up your laptop, and press the automated sequence to start it. Not quite that easy, I know. But basically it takes off, goes to space, and lands exactly where you took off. So you back the truck up over to it, you fill it up with gas again, you back away, and you press go again. And it's really almost that simple, or at least that's their target, is basically that simple. And when you do it that way, and you're not throwing it away, and you're just paying for the fuel is almost an irrelevant cost. I mean, in the rocket that I went up on the Soyuz, if you wanted to buy the space vehicle and have them launch it for you, they would charge about $200 million to launch it, which by the way is the cheapest and safest way to get to space right now is that Soyuz that I went on. But of that $200 million, it's only about $700,000 of fuel. And so again, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole thing. And so in the next few years, as the price of space access comes down by a factor of either 10 to 100, which is the ratio it's going to come down in the next 5 to 20 years, that means you're going to get below the cost that even I would have earned with my own space flight. And so even though I didn't pay for my first trip to space, within 10 to 20 years, I believe I will be able to pay for my trip to space. And on that day, I'm going to start going a lot. And I suspect many of you will also. And there's businesses like this protein crystal growth thing that I did. There's another competitor in Austin called Astrotech that's doing vaccine development that I think is doing a great job. And so the point is, I think that the day is coming where you're going to see this. Now I know this is an old picture, and I know you guys are well past this image of the future, but I just love this shot of one potential vision for the Armadillo vehicle that if you can give you as great a view as possible of this rocket that can take you up into space. The SpaceX guys are going to be taking people up. There's groups in England that have this 10-ton carrying vehicle they hope will be able to make it to space. The Bigelow, versions of the hotels in space. The X Prize has now moved on to sponsoring private vehicles to send rovers to the moon. We think those will be 1 in 5 or 10 years. Speaking of lunar rights, about 10 years ago I bought a lunar rover that's still on the moon. I'm actually the only private owner of an object on a foreign celestial body. And so lunar, and while that's been irrelevant for the last 20 years, I literally have hired a lawyer this year to start to legally stake that claim, because I think in the next 5 years there's going to be other people with rovers on the moon privately, so other people are going to start staking their claim. So I'm solidifying mine now before anybody tries to jump my claim. In fact, there's a photograph of it right there that the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter took. But it won't be that long, it's a couple of decades before we see lunar habitats, Martian outposts, and I think that this private industry is going to really be a big part of it. And I'm a big fan of Stephen Hawking that we took on our zero-G plane a few years ago, and he's a big believer that humanity really must move off the Earth because eventually life on this planet will be threatened, whether it's a meteorite or a nuclear holocaust or some virus that we unleash upon ourselves. Whatever the challenge will be, it will come. It's only a matter of in what time frame. And so, I think this is an imperative at a number of levels. But anyway, as you can see, I'll wrap up here by just saying that I really do think it is us, the geeks and gamers, who are ultimately going to